Good morning. Welcome to the American Thoracic Society webinar on September 11th, 2025. Today is the 24th year anniversary of the World Trade Center attacks at Ground Zero on 9/11. We'd like to take just 11 seconds of just quiet reflection before we start. This webinar is presented by the section on terrorism and inhalation disasters, TID, for the American Thoracic Society, ATS. Today's topic is reflections on 9/11, comparison to military burn pits, California wildfires, and the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment. Our speakers include Dr. Jacqueline Moline from the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. She is Senior Vice President for Occupational Medicine, Epidemiology, and Prevention at Northwell Health, and is the World Trade Center Monitoring Program Director for the Northwell Queens Program, and was formerly the first World Trade Center Monitoring Program Director at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. She also directs the department as chair of the Department of Occupational Medicine, Epidemiology, and Prevention at the Zucker School of Medicine, and is the New York State funded director of the Long Island Occupational Center. Our other speaker is Dr. Larry Amsel, Associate Professor of Clinical Psychiatry at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and a multiple PI with the Columbia University Global Psychiatric Epidemiology Group. So Dr. Moline will talk about the history of World Trade Center monitoring programs. Dr. Amsel will dive deeper into children who have reached adulthood and longitudinal studies. And I will talk about comparing all of these terrorism inhalational exposures, because the common theme is that we see parallels between the World Trade Center attacks, and that helped us learn about military burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in particular, K2 Karshi Kanan in Uzbekistan, as well as the California and Canadian wildfires and the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment. I'm going to advance the slide, and then Dr. Moline will be able to take over. So here's our overview for the morning. Reflections on 9/11. This will be taped and put on YouTube. The American Thoracic Society section on terrorism, inhalation disasters website and X. And we will get started.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can see my slides. It's an honor to be here, especially on September 11th. And I'm going to be speaking about the World Trade Center program and how it started, and what we're seeing, but how we can use it as a model for other disasters. And I think we'll be hearing how we can segue from learning what we have from the World Trade Center into how we can best treat people in disasters like East Palestine. So I'm going to first talk about asbestos and insulation workers, and this is not a talk about asbestos, although we know asbestos was at the World Trade Center, but it will bear with me for a minute, and I will give you perspective on why. So asbestos and insulation, I don't need to tell this group about the hazards of asbestos in terms of pulmonary health. Initially, people weren't looking at end users, and Selikoff in the 1960s began looking at a group of asbestos workers who were the insulators. In 1963, he did a study of about 1,500 workers who were part of local unions in New York and New Jersey. He found that about 264 out of the 1,522 had died. And of the 90% or so who work histories, this is what the examination or the evaluation included, which was a detailed occupational history, looking at previous illnesses, hospitalizations, smoking history, a physical examination targeted to the upper and lower respiratory systems, chest x-rays with a B reading, pulmonary function tests, blood work, and urine testing. They found pulmonary asbestosis was in about half of these highly exposed workers. Lung cancer and mesothelioma were also higher. Because of this study, they realized there was a need for a surveillance program. They realized that exposures did not end when the illnesses did not end, and the incidence of illnesses continued even after these folks stopped working. There was no regular surveillance programs before 1963. So in collaboration with the union, Selikoff and his colleagues started a medical surveillance program. This program that Selikoff ran was the framework for the surveillance program for the World Trade Center Health Program, as well as occupational lung registries. Insulators, and many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the results of this, which showed higher expected deaths than a higher number of deaths that occurred rather than what was expected. And while a smaller number of deaths had occurred in those who hadn't been 20 years out, a much larger number of workers died 20 years from onset, and it wasn't just age-related. It was primarily due to increased cancers. And again, here are the results of this study that I'm just going to briefly mention. There were a number of cancers, including about 200 mesotheliomas, 168 deaths from asbestosis. What they were able to do is show there was a higher risk of developing fatal diseases among these workers and diseases with long latency. So again, this is what they found. Here were the exams in this national program, which included occupational, clinical, smoking histories, labs, and spirometry. And they also had, of course, a chest X-ray. So here's just a slide to remind us all of the devastation that asbestos can do. And now let's move on to the World Trade Center. So 24 years ago, at just looking at my watch, at about 8:48 or 8:46 was the first plane, and then about 10 minutes after, the second plane hit. I think it was at 10:01 actually. And we saw that that more than 400,000 people were exposed to various substances. And as you can see in this picture, in the middle of the screen is actually covering residential buildings. As the dust cloud really inundated the entire community. At the bottom right of the screen, you see a bridge over the road. That bridge is leading to Stuyvesant High School, which is one of the leading high schools in the nation. And those students were all affected as well. So here's the World Trade Center district before and after the 9/11 attacks. You see how it looked. This is at 8:45 when the first tower hit, and then after the collapse of the World Trade Center. So here's a firefighter. You can see the extent of the dust cloud. The wind patterns were different that day, and normally it would have flown over New Jersey. But as you can see in the foreground, people are looking across in Jersey City at Lower Manhattan. Normally that would have been covered in dust. The wind pattern shifted that day, so everything went eastward, which actually was critical in terms of what communities were affected, and that actually led to Dr. Szema's study of Chinatown because children there were affected. This is a picture of people walking in the street after the buildings had collapsed. These are just random folks. The woman on the left of the screen was known as the Dust Lady, who was a office worker in the buildings. She actually succumbed to an aggressive lymphoma. I believe she also had sarcoidosis. So we know there are about 150 different toxicants, and it included asbestos, as I mentioned, hydrochloric acid, polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, silica, heavy metals, PAHs, dioxins, and a whole slew of other chemicals and metals. The dust was analyzed by Paul Eoy, who gathered it himself on September 12th and 13th. Much of what we know is because he was smart enough to go and collect the dust. What they found was that it was a highly alkaline dust, which has led to many of the impairments. 90% of the particulate matter was greater than 10 microns, which means that around 10% was smaller, which we know has tremendous implications. there was a large particles actually were deposited in the small airways as the body's defenses were overwhelmed. There was a study done by firemen who looked at firefighters, comparing urban firefighters in New York City to Israel, and found that after 9/11, they could find World Trade Center dust still within induced sputum. They compared it to the non-exposed, and there was obviously very different findings. We know that less than 20% of the firefighters on the first day wore a mask, respiratory symptoms, and wheezing, chest tightness, nasal congestion, and acute cough. Here's a table. It's a publication that just came out last month, which actually has one of the best compilations of many of the components and what they can do and where they came from. So you can see glass fibers, and there were 6,000 or 600 square feet of window panes, or I think it's 6,000 window panes in the World Trade Center. And all those were pulverized in addition to a lot of other glass-containing materials. There were various chemical compounds, and you can see many of the key health risks from them. The risk factors were some of the challenges have been the disaster. The dust, we know what was in it, but we don't have real-time air monitoring. So dust and surrogates have been used as time of arrival. And it's been demarcated into people who arrived and were in the dust cloud. People arrived on September 11th, people who arrived on the 12th or 13th. On the 14th, there was a huge rainstorm, so that cleared some of the ambient dust. But then we used people who were there for the 2 weeks after. So we've used these criteria to give a gradation of exposure, but we know risk factors for disease include the earlier arrival, cumulative exposure, whether people used masks and whether there were delays, and what people did. We also know that many folks were displaced, which actually was a good thing in terms of their health, but many of them came back quickly, or their homes or offices were contaminated, and it took a while to get that cleaned up. So I want to talk a little bit about the creation of the World Trade Center program, which I think can stand as a sort of a guidepost for setting up medical surveillance programs going forward. There are some other really wonderful programs as well that can be looked at, including there's a lung cancer screening for former nuclear plant workers that's run by the Department of Energy. But the World Trade Center program, we know, exposed about 500,000 people. We began seeing patients in September without a surveillance program because there was a need. People were coming to our offices in occupational medicine, going to pulmonologists, going to their primary doctors. There was just a rampant cough going around for anyone who was exposed. And again, as I talked about, individual exposure was duration and intensity based on time, but there was not individual level data. And this program was created to address the various illnesses that we expected would happen. So let me give you a little timeline. In fall 2001, actually on September 12th, we had our first meeting. Then we began meeting with union leaders, government leaders from the New York, New Jersey, our congressional delegation, and senators to develop a medical screening program, which was funded in April 2002. Within 3 months, we saw our first patient. The first patient was seen on July 16th, 2002. The fire department had received immediate funds, and they began seeing their employees as they already had an established medical unit, and they ramped up and began seeing all firefighters after 9/11. For the responders, and this is a group of folks who worked or volunteered at the site, so this included police officers, it included volunteers, it included construction workers. All the construction sites in New York City basically stopped on September 11th, and everyone rushed down there to lend their skills, whether they were iron workers, plumbers, pipe fitters, laborers. They went down there to assist. There were many people who came to volunteer, to provide food, to provide medical care. And then there were also the people who lived or worked in the community, and they set up a parallel program, primarily through philanthropy of the American Red Cross initially. So the program was for 1 year. We were supposed to see about, I think, 9,000 or 9,000 folks. We knew there was going to be a need. They extended it for a year. We were supposed to see 12,000 patients within the first 2 years. We saw 11,982, so pretty close. We were able to get additional funding in July 2004 for 5 years of continued surveillance. This allowed for monitoring, so people could come back for second and third exams. The time period was 18 months. It was chosen purely based on finances, but new enrollees were allowed into the program. In September 2006, the program was expanded to include treatment of World Trade Center associated conditions. In the first 5 years or the first 4 years of the program, we could only diagnose, we could not treat. There were some philanthropic programs, primarily funded by the American Red Cross, that provided treatment money for folks who did not have other insurance. And then in 2006, there was a list of conditions that were covered by the World Trade Center that included upper and lower respiratory PTSD, depression, acute, and I'll talk about that in a minute. In December 2010, January 2011, the James Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Reauthorization Act, or actually it was the Authorization Act, was passed and it established the current World Trade Center program for responders and survivors and included national programs. Research monies were also appropriated, and that is the program that exists now. The program was extended and reauthorized in 2016, and it was extended for 75 years. Initially, it was only for 5 years due to the decisions by Congress to start the program. And thankfully, we were able to get the program extended for another 75 years, which would cover children who were affected until they were 90. So initially, these were the conditions that were covered. And you can read them. And it was limited to these. Acute musculoskeletal conditions were time limited. Someone had to be injured basically while they were at work on the pile. The clinical findings initially were published. The FDNY published actually on September 11th, 2002, one of the first papers that defined World Trade Center cough, which was a cough that was severe enough to require leave for at least 4 weeks. The World Trade Center cough was actually used far more colloquially as anyone who had a cough after being at the World Trade Center, but that was the definition from the fire department paper. Other symptoms they found in the firefighters, and again, these are people who have passed rigorous physical examinations, and you cannot have asthma or being actively treated for asthma and be a firefighter. 95% of them now had symptoms of dyspnea or had symptoms of dyspnea after being at the World Trade Center site. 87% had GERD and 54% had nasal congestion. We did a study of iron workers in the first few months and also showed an increased incidence of wheeze, cough, and shortness of breath. In 2006, we looked back and we saw the results from about 9,400 responders in the first 2 years. Many of whom had been at the site on 9/11, and of that group, half of them had been in the dust cloud. Another 30% arrived in the next 2 days. So about 70% of our cohort was there in the first 2 days. So you can see where the folks worked. They either worked on the pile, adjacent to it, or at other sites like the piers where all the dust and all the debris was being offloaded, or at the landfill where the debris was brought. Here's the demographics. The population was about 38 years, primarily union members, as that was, New York is a relatively unionized town with respect to the uniform services as well as construction. And you can see the percentages of people who were there at various times. Most people were there in the first 3 days. The fire department did, as part of their study in the New England Journal, they looked to see who was highly exposed. And you can see 92% were part of the monitoring program. Unfortunately, they lost 343 members that day. And then you can see that 16% had high exposure, 70% were moderate, and 13% were not there in the first couple of days. Very few had no exposure. And then you can see the numbers as they broke out, that more people who were there earliest met that case definition, which was the cough for 4 weeks, the cough severe enough to require 4 weeks of leave. There were other cases of eosinophilic pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia, and then bronchial hyperreactivity was found in a cohort without severe cough. So there was definitely increased reactive airways. Studies have shown that there's a substantial decline in FEV1. The mean FEV1 decline was 372 milliliters, which is about 12 times more than would be normally expected due to aging. This was also seen by EMS workers, although they had a slightly less of a decline, but they still did have a decline, and it just showed that you didn't have to be a firefighter, and but having the exposure on the pile was a risk factor for declining FEV1. We also found in the responder cohort, 69% of folks had new or worsening respiratory in 1 to 3 years after the exam. For what we reported, 61% had new symptoms. Abnormal spirometry was seen in about 21%. Interestingly, low FVC was found, so perhaps air trapping was causing much of that, and there have been a number of studies subsequently looking at pulmonary function tests in this cohort, some of which have remained permanently declined. More non-smokers than would be, one more abnormal pulmonary function tests or spirometry than would be expected, about double the rate. And again, we see a dose response with earlier responders having more symptoms. The community residents, as I showed you on those first pictures, I showed the pictures not for just so that we can remember, although it has that purpose, but just so that people understand, if you're not from Manhattan, that people live right next to offices. So Lower Manhattan is a booming residential community. There was no consistent cleanup operation until about a year after. Respiratory symptoms were present in Manhattan residents, and cough was the most common symptom. And about twice as many people who had previously been asymptomatic developed symptoms in the areas compared to control areas of New York. There were no differences in spirometry, but the symptoms persisted, and over time, some of these findings became more apparent. So, there was controversy over this. Here's a much younger picture of me examining a patient from 2007. When we initially, there were a lot of questions about what we were finding, and we collectively in the World Trade Center programs, I think, as with everything, the facts come out, and we were able to show that the World Trade Center dust has impacted thousands of people, and that the screening program was valuable. But you have to understand that there's always going to be questions about that. So over time, we found links between World Trade Center exposures and specific types of cancer. We certainly know that there were carcinogens like silica, asbestos, dioxins. We found multiple myeloma that occurred pretty quickly. The striking finding was that many of these were young, and they were under 45 when they were diagnosed, which is unusual for myeloma. That case series has borne out, as we know, that World Trade Center rates of myeloma are increased. FDNY conducted a first larger study looking at cancer incidence, and they found that there was an increase 2012 study of the World Trade Center registry participants. These are folks who filled out questionnaires in various waves. It started with about 90,000 people. There has been attrition over time, but these were residents, these were firefighters, these were responders. This was people with different types of exposure. They found significant increases in prostate cancer, thyroid, and multiple myeloma in the final year of the study, and from 2012, which led to the World Trade Center Health Program adding a final rule to add a wide range of cancers to the World Trade Center related health conditions. A number of other cancers were added bit by bit when there was epi-evidence. The most recent was uterine cancer. If you recall, or you probably didn't see, but on the demographic slide from the responder program, it was overwhelmingly male. The survivor program is equally male and female, and over time there were enough cases of uterine cancer among the women that it was added, but it was the last cancer to be added. So currently there are 8 centers of excellence in the New York metropolitan area. There is a national network for people who live outside the metro area. And this is for folks, people came in from every state to respond to 9/11. People went back to their communities and they are eligible for the program. There's a third party that is contracting with the World Trade Center Health Program and works in different communities to find providers for the program. There's also many folks who left the area because they've retired or they decided to move and they can get care through the national program. So there's healthcare services from medical and mental health professionals. One of the hallmarks of our program has been to integrate mental and physical health from the onset so that everyone is evaluated for both. And these cohorts are still open as long as they meet eligibility criteria for being present for a certain number of time or days. And now the exam includes the annual monitoring and surveillance, medical and mental health treatment for the covered conditions, cancer screening for anything that is a USPSTF A or B recommendation, benefits counseling, and there's a research program. Currently, it's on hold, but we're hoping that there will be a resumption of the federal grants that are mandated in the coverage in the coming up. And then the treatment coverage depends on approval from an affiliated provider confirming the likely diagnosis. It's then sent to the government for certification. And here's a list of what we've seen. This is completed as of the last quarter. You can see that there have been a total of nearly 50,000 cancers, about 41,000 with rhinosinusitis, GERD, asthma is in about 22%, and mental health conditions are PTSD is about 17,000. COPD and chronic respiratory conditions are also occurring at high levels, and you can see the other diseases. The responders are in the teal, and the survivors, and that's people who lived or worked in the area, are in the marine blue. You can see who's affected by what. And the current status is that we provide extensive health monitoring. A new initiative was started, I think we're going to be hearing about, to look at the impacts of people 21 and younger. We're looking to see if autoimmune and cardiovascular diseases can be added. We know there have been a number of people with these diseases, 550 with different autoimmune diseases, for example, and 4,400 with cardiovascular disease. There is science behind it. We're hoping that these petitions will be approved. And there's no new research efforts. There's been a lot of work out of my colleagues at Stony Brook looking at early onset dementia, as well as looking at epigenetic alterations from a variety of different researchers. So what have we learned? We know it's important to mobilize resources quickly after a disaster, particularly with respect to hazards. At any disaster, it's important to establish a perimeter and have a rigorous accounting of who is present and where. This was not done at the World Trade Center. It was very difficult to find out exactly who was exposed. I mean, it is interesting because we estimated there were 90,000 responders and volunteers, and we have about 90,000 responders and volunteers in the World Trade Center program. So those estimates came in pretty close, but Information about exposures and early risk should have been made available as soon as possible. One of the challenges was that there was a huge focus on the fact that there was asbestos in the dust and asbestos in the buildings, which we are now going to be on the lookout for because we know there's a latency period. However, it wasn't causing any acute health effects. And because there wasn't a focus on the fact that this dust was causing so much reactive airways, many people, the word didn't get out that people maybe could have received different treatment that could have prevented them from progressing. You need to make sure that cleanup activities are done appropriately for the safety of the cleanup workers as well as the people in the communities that are affected. It's critical to establish registries of responders and reoccupants so that you can understand the nature of the disaster and follow them up over time. And funding should be secured for long-term follow-up if indicated with any of these disasters. So lest we never forget, I think we've learned a lot from the World Trade Center. Most importantly, we've been able to provide care for patients that we know has if you're part of the program, your morbidity and mortality is about 30% less than if you had exposures that were not related, that you had, if you're in the programs, you're 30% more likely to survive and do better than folks who had exposures at the World Trade Center who are not part of the program. So if you have any patients that were part of the program that were exposed on 9/11, please ask and encourage them to join one of the programs. People are used to seeing people with these exposures. We pick up things early, get them treated, and we have amazing case managers who can help them navigate. And I'm happy to take a couple questions if we have time.
Thank you, Dr. Moline. Dr. Takash, Professor Emerita, University of Pennsylvania, Allergy Immunology, asks, any studies of exposure and effect on the immune disorders or recurrent infections?
That's a great question. I think there haven't been in terms of immune disorders, we've been looking. One of the challenges is that they aren't covered conditions. So we don't have required surveillance, or we don't. If someone has a covered condition, if you came to me and you said, how many people have GERD, I could give you that number and I can give you a slide that has how many have GERD because it's a covered condition and we know who's been certified. For autoimmune conditions and other immunological problems, we don't have that. So a lot of it is from the annual self-disclosed data that has to be corroborated. So that is one of the challenges we've had. It's a great question. With respect to recurrent infections, we know that people are more susceptible, but I don't think there's been a specific study on that.
Another question is from Rebecca Tuis-Dubrow, from a reporter from the Yale. Is there an estimate of the total death toll?
So it's about 8,200 folks in the programs have died. Part of the challenge is that we don't necessarily know all of what they died of, but we do know that I think there are about 3,500 cancers associated with 9/11 and folks that have passed away. So there's about 8,200 deaths. We know it's about 3 times the number, almost 3 times the number that died on 9/11. There's, for folks wanting data, there are on the website cdc.gov/WTC. There's a lot of data if people are looking to find the numbers of people affected, how many people are in the program.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Moline. That was
My
great.
pleasure.
And Dr. Moline's doing competing things, press releases today, MSNBC, and conferences with the AMA. So thank you so much. We know you're very busy.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay. So I'm going to look at comparisons among military burn pits, specifically Iraq and Afghanistan, and K2, which is Karshi Kanan, Uzbekistan, which is the way our U.S. military invaded Afghanistan, the California and Canadian wildfires, and most recently the 2023 East Palestine, Ohio train derailment. And you can see what we learned from the World Trade Center disaster allowed us to discover and be aware of important exposures related to these other disasters, and vice versa. So I'll show you a brief clip from the press.
From the Fox 5 studios in New York, watching First Edition.
People were caught in the dust around Ground Zero on 9/11, and now a new study has found that children may have been seriously affected, especially ones living in Chinatown. The study was done by researchers at SUNY Stony Brook. It found the number of young asthma patients who visited local health clinics went from about 300 a year to 500 following 9/11.
So this talk is broken up to 4 parts. So our initial studies were about asthma, allergy, and lung injury in children and rescue workers post 9/11. Then we informed our data to look at military burn pits, specifically in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now at K2 Karshi Kanan, Uzbekistan. And most recently in the news, you will see about the California Canadian wildfires, which has spread and affected the air quality throughout the United States. And all of these studies have allowed us to propose a project for the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment of 2023 for the NIH. So as Dr. Moline pointed out, this is a famous photo of some of the residents and workers on 9/11. And here's a satellite image of Manhattan. You can see Central Park is that rectangle in the upper northeast corner, but that plume is moving southeast below Canal Street, and it envelopes the entire region of Chinatown, Manhattan. As previously discussed, not only was asbestos detected 3% of the bulk dust mass, but Paul Leoy, when he collected this on the top of a taxi on September 16th, found polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, dioxins, pesticides, phthalate esters, which cause occupational asthma, plastic, and even partially burned jet fuel. And this allowed us, when we were looking at burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan, to look for burned JP8, which was used to burn pits. Furthermore, there were inorganic metals, and similarly, when we started looking at lung biopsies from veterans, that allowed us to be aware of the possibility of metals. 70% of the samples comprised construction materials, and they were highly rich in calcium compounds, which irritate the upper airways. There are a variety of other metals and phosgene, which is now seen in the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment, where there were 1.1 million pounds that overturned and then were later burned by the firefighters, and a variety of gases as well. So we initially were notified that by the 2000 census, 1 year before 9/11, that among the ethnicities in New York City, the Chinese Americans had the lowest self-reported rates of asthma of only 6.8% versus Puerto Ricans at 28%, and non-Hispanic whites 11%, and non-Hispanic blacks 15%. So it was very low initially. So we hypothesized that in Chinatown after 9/11, pediatric asthma patients exposed to the World Trade Center disaster may experience increased asthma severity. And now that may hypothesis apply to California wildfires as well. And number two, some previously healthy children may be newly diagnosed with asthma after September 11, 2001. These were all Chinese American pediatric asthmatic patients who live in New York City. Chinatown is the largest socioeconomically homogeneous neighborhood proximal to the Twin Towers, which is 3 blocks away. And they all receive medical care at the same center, the Charles B. Wang Community Health Center, formerly Chinatown Health Clinic, which is 1.5 miles away from the ground zero. And these doctors are all salaried. There's no incentive to see more or fewer patients. The average age was 8. There were more boys than girls. They all grew in height during this time frame study. And even though they were mostly first-generation Americans, they already had elevated body mass indices. We broke down the regions, and this is how we're looking at East Palestine, Ohio, to less than 5 miles away by residential zip code and greater than 5 miles away. And you can see that these groups are evenly matched. So we found that asthma clinic visits and asthma prescriptions increased after 9/11. You can see in red, those are the zip codes within 5 miles, and in tan, those are the zip codes away from 5 miles, greater than 5 miles. The blue star in the center is the clinic, and the two Twin Towers are to the left in this diagram. But what you can see also in the northeast corner, there's another blue star. So there's another clinic 11.9 miles away in Flushing, Queens, staffed by the same doctors in Manhattan, again, salaried with no incentive to see fewer or more patients. And in Region 1, we found that the number of clinic visits for asthma increased statistically significantly, whereas Region 2, it did not. So more asthma visits for children who live within 5 miles. There were more clinic visits for asthma. There were more asthma prescriptions, and it was borderline positive for rescue inhaler dose, though oral corticosteroid use was not statistically significant. But definitely more asthma visits for children living within 5 miles. Moreover, as seen in the video clip, the number of children with asthma increased by 66%, and the number of pediatric asthma visits increased by 48.8%. So these are large increases in numbers. Whereas in Flushing, 11.9 miles away, staffed by the same doctors, in the subsequent year, the number of children with asthma decreased by 10.9%, and pediatric asthma visits decreased by 13.6%. So 11.9 miles away was not as bad. When we looked at mean percent predicted peak flow rates, it solely decreased for those living within 5 miles, below 80% for 6 months. As you can see here, before 9/11, these two curves are matched, the yellow and the red. But in Region 1, the kids who live within 5 miles had a persistent drop in their peak flow rates for 6 months, whereas the kids in Region 2 further away did not. So our conclusion was that residential proximity to ground zero was predictive of the degree of decrease in asthma health, and exposure to the World Trade Center disaster led to increased asthma severity. After September 11, 2001, these children had more asthma-related clinic visits. These children received more prescriptions for asthma medications. Those children living within 5 miles had more clinic visits after September 11, 2001, whereas the increase in visits for children living further than 5 miles from ground zero was not significant. The mean percent predicted peak expiratory flow rates decreased solely for those patients living within 5 miles of ground zero after September 11, 2001. So asthma severity worsened after September 11, 2001 in pediatric asthmatic patients living near ground zero. We then looked at spirometry and PM 2.5 or 2.5 micron sized particles measured continuously every 3 days. There were 2 air pollution monitors, Thermo Fisher, deployed by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation on the roof of the elementary school in Manhattan. We also vacuumed the inside of the school to look for aeroallergens, specifically aeroallergen concentrations in dust for mouse, that's moose M1, rat, rattus M1, feline, FeLD1, cockroach, blotgy1, and 3 types of dust mite antigens, including Dermatophagoides perennicis and Farinii, and Canif1, which is dog. If you look at those children now living only less than a mile from ground zero versus those further away, the rates for self-reported asthma were about 13% for those within a mile versus only 4.8 or 5% further away. And the self-reported asthma rates for children who received spirometry were also different. Post 9/11, if you looked at children who were ages 4 to 12 years old at the time of our study, 58 out of 202 kids, or 29%, had an FEV1 less than 80%. If you look at kids who are alive on 9/11, greater than 7 years old at the time of our study, 17% had an FEV1 less than 75%. So these are extremely high numbers. The air pollution monitors on the roof of the school measured levels that are above this horizontal blue bar of EPA limits of PM 2.5 over 35 micrograms per cubic meter. You can see the red lines exceed that. The extremely high red line was on July 4th. That's the Macy's fireworks parade. But the rest of the year, you can see that the levels are higher than what is normal for healthy air. Interestingly, we did not find levels of indoor aero allergens that were significant. So that, number one, Chinatown asthma rates, even years later, are still higher than other ethnic groups. It was 29% versus the current New York City reference rate of 13%. These rates indicate persistence of elevated rates as originally suggested by Dr. Debbie Lin and colleagues. Number two, air pollution levels exceeded EPA standards and were unhealthy, greater than 35 micrograms per cubic meter per day. And this may account for increased asthma incidence. It is possible that exposure to various toxins on 9/11 accentuated the effect of subsequent exposure to air pollution. The difference between parent-reported prevalence of asthma of 12.6% and tested prevalence in these children of 29% also corresponds to those reported by the Harlem Children's Zone Asthma Initiative and suggests a high degree of unmet need for asthma treatment and lower than unnecessary child well-being. We further looked at the Harvard Redline questionnaire for asthma, and we started conducting impulse oscillometry to look at distal airways narrowing and airways hyperresponsiveness. This was translated into Chinese as well. And we looked at parental and child responses to these surveys, and they correlated in general. We also looked at airways resistance, systemic resistance. In general, boys had higher airways resistance than girls. The mean R5, X5, and R20 was given in centimeters of water per liter, and boys had average rates higher than that of girls. And we looked at air pollution levels compared to the rest of New York City. There are various other boroughs, and there are air pollution monitors deployed in the Bronx and in Queens compared to the red bar, which is the EPA standard value. Manhattan Division Street is the name of the yellow bar, which is deployed on the roof of the school. And you can see that same curve is what I showed earlier, and you can see that these levels are higher than the rest of New York City. And in addition, these levels exceeded both World Health Organization and EPA standards. When we speciated the air pollution looking for metals and other components, these were also high. And this correlated to what should be found in catalytic converters from diesel trucks. When I was standing outside of the school, I counted 100 diesel trucks per hour, and we counted annual bridge traffic, which increased over the time period of our study. So a variety of components, which are metals, were found as well. So allergy and respiratory symptoms are common among those children and confirmed by parents responding to the survey distributed among classrooms at the closest elementary school to the World Trade Center site. There were strong correlations between responses from children and their parents. Frequent severe symptoms such as wheezing and chest tightness juxtaposed with use of allergy and asthma medications supports the concept that these patients are not clinically well controlled. Boys and girls in this cohort had increased values of airway resistance at 5 Hertz, with boys having higher values than girls, and frequency dependence between the resistance values at 5 Hertz and 20 Hertz suggests that the anatomical location of their problem is small airways dysfunction. That's the distal peripheral airways, not central or proximal. Air pollution levels are high and contain detectable lead, vanadium, and indium. When we looked at rescue workers comparing to children, 17 years later after 9/11, we still found that rescue and cleanup workers exposed to the World Trade Center fallout had a high incidence of allergic sensitivity and evidence of permanent small airways dysfunction by impulse oscillometry, characterized by distal airways narrowing and airway hyperresponsiveness. So this is severe lung injury, and all of these patients were on biologics and did not improve. They only had partial reversibility. So all these studies have informed us when we were confronted in 2004 with returning veterans from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so now we're going to discuss comparison to military burn pits as well as Karshi Kanan, Uzbekistan, which is how the staging operations led to the invasion of Afghanistan. So one of our residents, who's now a pulmonologist, just made this slide showing that exposure in military theater entails a variety of things, including burn pits where you burn your trash in open air with JP8 jet fuel, outdoor aeroallergens along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates River, ancient Mesopotamia. There's date palm pollen, which has been cultivated for 5,000 years, so that's spring tree season. NASA showed us videos showing that sandstorms can travel from Africa deep into Iraq, and Captain Mark Lowes from the U.S. Naval War College was able to culture some unusual exotic bacteria and viruses from the dust collected in Iraq. Initially, soldiers were housed in Saddam Hussein's palaces before they received containerized housing units, and pre-Iraq war data indicated that the most common indoor air allergen was the mold Aspergillus, which can cause, as pulmonologists know, allergic bronchopulmonary aspergillosis, a severe form of asthma. when we fire mortar-fired rounds or when we get shelled by the enemy, there is blast over pressure from these munitions, and that blast over pressure causes shock waves to the lung and shears stress on your delicate lung sacs or alveoli. Specifically in K2 Karshi-Kanan, Uzbekistan, which was used to raid Afghanistan, the Taliban actively was shelling this base, and these doctors and veterans soldiers were exposed to mortar fire on top of Karshi-Kanan. Improvised explosive devices were the first roadside bombs used frequently in this war, as well as vehicle improvised explosive devices, which can aerosolize metal as well. So when we looked at lungs from soldiers exposed to burn pits, here are 5 patients from 5 different states in the United States, all have a common thread of exposure to the burn pits. You can see that all of them have the same peak, meaning that they all had burned JPA jet fuel in their lungs. It was burned and oxidized, meaning we can also calculate the temperature at which this is burned. We used Raman spectrometry, which is the same machine on the Mars rover used to study dust on Mars by NASA. And geologists calculate the temperature of meteorites as they enter the Earth using the Boozman-Cody equation. And we calculated the temperature at 300 degrees C prior to inhalation, which is the temperature of burning jet fuel. This allowed us to reflect back vice versa on lung cancer samples that we collected from patients who were exposed to the World Trade Center. Currently, the rates of lung cancer are not higher among World Trade Center victims because it hasn't been that long due to the latency or the time course of developing lung cancer. But our medical student, Dorian Passant, found burned JA1 commercial jet fuel dead center of a lung cancer from a patient exposed to the World Trade Center. And this was informed by our military burn pit studies. So that Pasteur was quoted as saying, chance favors the prepared mind. He actually said, in the fields of observation, chance only favors the mind which is prepared. Similarly, in this patient who was part of the Rikers Island response team to the World Trade Center site was asymptomatic after 9/11, but he later on served as a soldier in Iraq, and he was in charge of the laundry staff in Balad and got exposed to everything on their uniforms. We found titanium and iron in his lungs, and it was spread throughout the lung. In fact, in the upper right-hand corner, you can see iron that's orange. You can see titanium in the same location on the wall of the air sac. It's orange. And then when you superimpose these colors, you get this pink dot, meaning there's iron bound to titanium in fixed mathematical ratios of 7 parts iron to 1 part titanium distributed throughout this soldier's lung. And this soldier was exposed to both disasters. Specifically regarding burn pits, I mentioned K2 or Karshi-Kanan, Uzbekistan. Doctors on the ground there found yellow cakes shown on the left, or enriched uranium, which was setting off the Geiger counter. So this is a base where the Soviet Union used to destroy nuclear weapons. And later on, this base was evacuated by the US military because they discovered Series 5 nerve gas agents. The VA website acknowledges that there's not only asbestos, lead, solvents, and radioactive particles there, but we know that burn pits were burned on top of all of this. And as I mentioned earlier, this base was actively shelled by the Taliban because the Taliban knew that we were invading Afghanistan. And in fact, these doctors had to perform surgery in tents next to solvents seen in the lower left-hand corner in the soil, and burn pits were actively operating there. And you can see that the climate was that for dust. Now, knowing this, we now are proposing for the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment to use portable near-infrared spectroscopy to identify chemicals in the water aquifers, as well as the soil and the dust. And we are proposing for Uzbekistan a drone that can measure radon and radiation. How do California-Canadian wildfires compare? Well, our student now is at Los Angeles County, USC, and we're collaborating with Chris Landon from Ventura County. And you can see even miles away from the epicenter in Malibu, the dust storm is approaching you. The blue sky is cloudy. So in California, we've sent out some devices working with Dr. Kim Gandy at Stanford, a continuous pulse oximeter called the Circle device from Bodymetrics to have beat-to-beat oxygen saturation and calculation of heart rate variability during sleep. And in one case, you can see that this patient is desaturating. The numbers are dropping below the 90% mark, which is between the blue and the red. So the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment of 2023 that Dr. Moline and I commented on in the New York Post was a disaster where a train derailed and 1.1 million pounds of polyvinyl chloride spilled. The firefighters there deliberately burned it, and then they moved the chemicals into soil berms. This has led to leaching in the water aquifers and the soil, and the plumes spread out over a continuous region. The NIH is interested in studying a 50-mile radius in concentric circles up to Pittsburgh. We're using wearable sensors in 4 local fire departments to compare air pollution monitoring and subsequent air pollution exposure, like a 2-hit hypothesis, like we talked about with World Trade Center. As you can see, when firefighters engage in training and also at scenes, they're wearing self-contained breathing apparatus. This is our training in New York to compare to the Ohio data, but emergency medical service personnel are the same distance away and wear no protection. So working with the Cornerstone Research Group in Ohio, Kayla Keaton, our medical student at Penn State, is using this to measure air pollution, PM2.5, carbon monoxide, air temperature, and volatile organic compounds, looking at multiple firefighters simultaneously. Dr. Nick Favazza now is an intern at Tufts, was our Zucker School of Medicine medical student at Hofstra Northwell, decided to take some of Paul Leoy's dust. We gave it down the trachea of a mouse, and you can see on the left side, there are no cells. It's histologically normal by conventional light microscopy. We're using a new technique called imaging mass cytometry, and that allowed us to detect collagen and inflammatory cells, CD45 positive, before you can even see microscopy changes. And it's worse in mice that are missing a key protective gene called vasoactive intestinal peptide. And humans also have VIP. If you're missing VIP, that may be worse. And you can see it in regular mice as well, but it's not as bad. So reflecting on 9/11, starting with the World Trade Center disaster, our community concern about exposure in Chinatown, Manhattan, and analogously now in East Palestine, Ohio, prepared us to understand military burn pits, California and Canadian wildfires, and now the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment. Key point, these are not isolated incidents, but are rather harbingers of future disasters. As the philosopher George Santayana said in the 20th century, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Thank you. We have a chat from Dr. Gordon Peters, who was one of the doctors on the ground. He says, thanks to the American Thoracic Society for having this talk. As a physician assigned to K2 immediately after the attacks in New York City, these effects are real for airmen, soldiers, Marines, and sailors, and he was at both places. Dr. Larry Amsel is loading his contact by Gmail if you would like to contact him. So I'd like now to introduce Dr. Larry Amsel, Associate Professor of Clinical Psychiatry at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons and a key investigator with the Columbia University Global Psychiatric Epidemiology Group. He is going to discuss long-term physical and psychological, mind-body consequences for children, now adults, exposed to 9/11. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. So just a technical check. Can I be heard and can my slides be seen?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm going to leave enough time so that there are questions both for myself and for Tony. Our talks are related. We're collaborators and our talks are related. So we're going to do the Q&A for both of our talks after this talk. Tony has already introduced my topic, which is, again, a longitudinal study. This differs from a lot of the studies. With Tony is the exception in having looked at kids. Most of the work on 9/11 has been in adults. First responders obviously were adults and were one of the primary concerns. But we were focused on people exposed as children. And I just want to emphasize as I go through the talk, because we talk about children, but actually it's 25 years later. So those children, are now adults. So I'm gonna quickly review three studies. One was the World Trade Center Board of Education study. One was a study we call the Stress and Well-Being Study, which was a follow-up longitudinal study 14 years later, and that's going to be the main focus. And then we have an ongoing study, which is has a long title, but you just think of it as the S&W, which is Stress and Well-Being Secondary Follow-Up, which is a follow-up taking place from right now. So it's 20, some 25 years later. So I'm with a global psychiatric epidemiology group, which is an interesting group because it's a collaboration between the child psychiatry division at Columbia and the epidemiology department at the Columbia School of Public Health. And it's also connected to the New York State Psychiatric Institute. So it's one of those groups that has many affiliations. And as a group which involves both clinicians and epidemiologists and basic scientists, we have a very interdisciplinary methodological approach. We're interested in the life course perspective, which has served us well because it guided us towards longitudinal studies, as we'll mention again. And it also has a developmental focus, thinking about not only exposures, but how does the particular stage and age of someone exposed matter in terms of the thing? Is it the same to be exposed at the age of 5 or at the age of 15? We also try to include families. We're very careful about having match control. So in our example, the match controls, as you'll see, for the S&W, which is the child follow-up study, the match controls were just kids of the same age and demographics, just living in Queens. And Tony's already, given us the information that, for the kids in Chinatown, a lot of the adverse findings were not true just a couple of miles away. So it really made sense to look at kids at Queens. But it does also represent a pretty tight control. In other words, they're not that different except for exposure on that day. We try to do field-based, face-to-face interviews whenever we can. Obviously, during COVID, we had to switch to Zoom, but that's our preferred method. Our title, Global Psychiatric Epidemiology. So we try to do some work globally, and that's work that we've done internationally involving both trauma, but also suicide prevention. We have a study now in Guyana, which is a country with one of the highest suicide rates, trying to look at what causes the suicide rate. That's in terms of our global work. In terms of our quote unquote psychiatric work or mental health work, we're interested in exposures to violence and disasters, not only 9/11, but other kinds of exposures. For example, we have a group in the South Bronx that's been exposed to the criminal justice system. We see that as a psychosocial exposure, but also an interesting exposure that children may go through. And we look at the long-term impact of that. I'm going to plug a book that our team has put together for those people who are interested in disasters in general. And these are both exposures to toxins, but also exposures to psychological issues. This international perspective on disasters and its effect on specifically children's mental health. It's kind of unique because it really covers a couple dozen disasters, both man-made, industrials, war, and natural disasters, tsunamis. And what we did was we invited the mental health people who dealt with the kids involved in these disasters, and we invited them to submit academic chapters as to what was the effect on the children and what did they do to help these kids. And I was in the middle of putting my email in, which is my Gmail. I'll put it in when I'm done again. And if you write me, I can get you a copy of this book. I can get you a PDF copy of this book if you're interested in seeing it. So that gives you a background of who our team is. And now what happened on 9/11. So immediately after 9/11, our team leader, who is Dr. Hoven, who has been the creator of this team, has been my mentor for many years and has been very devoted to children's mental health her whole life as an epidemiologist. So she immediately recognized that there would be a need to understand not just what terrible things that were happening to adults who were exposed to the pile, but also to the children in the neighborhood and the children who were exposed and what was happening to them in the short term. So her first interest was what was happening to them in the short term. It was impossible, obviously, in the kind of short term she was interested in get funding, and actually Dr. Hoven got a bunch herself and a bunch of other people simply devoted their time to this in a pro bono fashion, doing very rigorous research, but without funding. And what this design was to look at the schools, which was a representative sample of New York City public schools, and that would be involve schools that were very close to the World Trade Center and those that were far away, so that there could be comparisons between levels of exposure on that day. So it ultimately involved 94 schools, as well as about 8,000 students. And what was the finding? So what I'd like you to do in this is to look across, follow with me the first line here in the table where it says PTSD. And so what after analyzing these 8,000 questionnaires, which involved children describing their experience of exposure, but also going through detailed questionnaires embedded in this one large questionnaire about different symptomatology, so that we could predict most likely which of those kids had PTSD. So based on our 8,000 sample, the first line here, it's funny that this is the first line, should be the last line actually logically, but it is the first entry. So we made an estimate based on the percentage that we saw in our sample of how many children would have PTSD. In other words, we knew how many of our sample children had PTSD, and that projected that there would be 75,000 students in the school system that would have PTSD. So what was that based on? Well, let's look at the exposure level here. Moving over to the next column, we divided the kids, you can see, almost evenly into severe, moderate, and mild exposures. We've already mentioned Stuyvesant, the school right next to it. So everyone in Stuyvesant had a high exposure. They were all evacuated, etc. So notice that the percentage of people who most likely had PTSD, and that was, again, based on answering the questionnaire. There was 18% of those kids with a high exposure probably had PTSD. If we compare this to pre-September 11th known epidemiological rates, which were about 3.3 in the general population of children that age, you can see that this is a huge increase. Now, if it was moderate exposure, then there were 10%, so it's less. And if it was mild exposure, it's practically the same as pre-11. So that was pretty close to non-exposure altogether. So having gone through the PTSD in detail, the same was true for all of these disorders. Major depression was elevated. We can see it was up 11% compared to estimates that ran from 2 to 6%. Generalized anxiety. Interestingly, because this is going to come up again, separation anxiety. So those of you not psychiatrists, think of this as school refusal, where the separation anxiety is where kids are afraid to be away from their parents. It's also possible to have separation anxiety as an adult, where you're afraid of being away from people who are well known to you and among strangers. So separation anxiety disorder is most common in kids, but I want you to put a bookmark on that because we're going to talk about that in a minute, some more. But look at how we're 20% with separation anxiety. And if we understand that a child's world is its parents, so a child's world and its safety is its parents, When there's a dangerous situation, it can be expected that kids will attach to, feel dependent on their parents in an unsafe situation. When that reaches the level of pathology, in other words, it's so intense that it's actually a disorder, you call it separation anxiety. And there we see it was 20% compared to the pre 9/11 estimates for that age group. You can see those estimates ranged at the most to 7.7%, depending on the study that you looked at, but 20% was clearly much higher. Also, panic disorder, which is for those of you not familiar, panic disorder is an episodic experience of panic attacks, which are very severe experiences of anxiety, including a lot of somatic symptoms, heart races, sweating, all kinds of things. And many of you are familiar with panic disorder because it often presents in an emergency room. For adults, it often presents as people say, come to the emergency room, I'm having a heart attack. I think I'm having a heart attack. It has that powerful physical impact. So panic disorder was also raised. And then agoraphobia, which is related to separation anxiety, but different. Agoraphobia is a fear of being out in the open, a fear of being in the agora, which was, of course, the marketplace in ancient history was called the agora. So people having fear of being in public places, making it difficult for them to go out, play with others, etc. So you can see that immediately after 9/11, Dr. Hovind identified that there were these, in the months afterwards, there were these very likely, again, this was based on a questionnaire, this one was not a face-to-face interview, but nevertheless, based on the questionnaire, we could do probabilistic estimates that these were the most likely disorders that these kids had. The other thing that was interesting is looking not as the child's exposure, but the exposure of their parents. What happens when a child lived in a household in which a family member was involved in the World Trade Center? Dad was as a cop. Mom was an EMT worker. You can see the blue lines represent if there's a family member with the World Trade Center, and you can see that in those, not all of these show up, but PTSD in the kids showed up. Again, means if my father was a cop, if I had this elevated chance of having PTSD myself, similarly separation anxiety, and similarly agoraphobia. And this differed depending on what kind of first responder, by the way, which because of time, I don't have a slide to show, but it differed. And interestingly, for firefighters, it was the lowest, and for EMT workers, it was the highest, with cops coming in between. So that was the immediate study done in a couple of months later. But Dr. Hovind was very aware that there were very few longitudinal studies. Most of what we know, and you'll see there's a lot of literature, there had been a lot of literature prior to 9/11 about what happens when bad things happen to kids. But it usually was done retroactively, right? With questionnaires, people were evaluated for mental health, and then there was a question about what was your childhood experience. So we wanted to make sure that there would be prospective studies, longitudinal studies. And so Dr. Hovind started the stress and well-being study to focus on what happened to these kids long term. And here is the conceptual model. We think of September 11 Child World Trade Center exposure. Here is the exposure. And what happens? Because of the exposure, there are life changes. Family, economic hardship, school, residency, relocation, different safety procedures, things that happen in the child's life. This could lead to childhood mental disorders, which we were going to measure, but also to changes in youth behaviors, substance abuse, high-risk behaviors, sexual behaviors, injuries. So what we wanted to see was to understand how exposure to 9/11 impacted life changes, impacted mental health, and impacted other kinds of behaviors, not just mental health. And of course, any good research study is going to have the possible moderators, and we looked at parental World Trade exposure, as a possible moderator, gender, age, etc. And uniquely, one of the things that was unique here, we also looked at a formal decision-making process where we asked kids to do a task involving decision-making, which comes out of something called computational psychiatry, a new area in psychiatry. And we looked at that as well. So what are our samples? Well, we created an index sample, and largely this was recruited through the World Trade Center, health registry, which you just heard a great deal about by one of its founders. And we had kids from ages 0 to 18 on 9/11. So they were 0 to 18 on the day of the exposure. They're obviously much older than that today. We looked at kids who were highly exposed on 9/11, meaning they attended school below Canal Street and saw the plane crash or the towers collapse with their own eyes. Those were the highly exposed, and we also had a subgroup of moderate, less highly exposed. And then we had a control group, as I mentioned, 500 community controls from Queens. We made sure that our questionnaires were available in Spanish, Cantonese, Mandarin. And here were the measures. So this is what this was 14 years after 9/11. For these 1,500, again, 1,000 index kids who had exposure and 500 kids from Queens who didn't have exposure, and they all went through all of these questionnaires, which fell into the categories I mentioned, which was, what were the mental health outcomes, also what were behavioral outcomes, but also what were some of the inputs and some of the possible confounding questionnaires. Any kind of prior problems, etc. Similarly, I'm sorry, my slides are jumping. Similarly, we had for each index child and for each control child, we also interviewed a parent to give us information both about themselves and to have corroborating information about the child. And so here was the measures that we used in the parents. Again, these were extensive interviews, and these were done face-to-face as per our technique, as we had, this wasn't being done immediately afterwards, so we had the time. To be more specific, our assessment of psychiatric conditions did very thorough questionnaires, which are these questionnaires, the face-to-face questionnaires, they're not clinical assessments per se. It's not a psychiatrist doing it, but they are manualized questionnaires that really have a very high predictive value. And so we can look at major depression, generalized anxiety, etc., a number of different psychiatric conditions. And then for the physical conditions, in this first follow-up study, we just had questionnaires. Here we just had questionnaires. We just asked people about common physical disorders that they might have. And here was a list of the physical disorders that we looked at. What were our demographics? You can see the demographics are laid out here, and the demographics were pretty representative. I said in the beginning that we like representative samples, and it turned out that our samples were pretty representative of the demographics of the exposures. And this breaks it down in greater detail. If we had more time, I'd go through all of this, but I just want to bring you down to the last three rows, because one of the things we looked at was the economic status. So we had a category of people who live very well, live comfortably, or those who live check to check. And you can see again that we have captured the percentages captured were close to what the population would predict. So this slide here gives us the overall major finding. So I want to spend a moment on this. No comorbidity, which means no morbidity, people who had no morbidity. The white line is people who were unexposed. The yellow line is exposed, and you can see they're practically the same thing. And you can see that this pink line is high exposure, and only half the people had no comorbidity. In other words, no psychiatric or no physical. Now, just looking at psychiatric disorder, and just to emphasize this, so this is psychiatric disorders 14 years after exposure as a child to 9/11, and you can see that the unexposed, kids do have psychiatric disorders, and the unexposed and the low exposed are about the same, but those with high exposure had a higher rate of psychiatric disorder, and that's what we expected, and that's really what we were looking for. We were looking for the psychiatric disorder sequelae. But to our surprise, the physical sequelae, the physical consequences, were even higher. I don't mean they had a higher physical. You can see the physical ones on the pink, for example, are only 26%. So what do I mean it was higher? I mean it was higher compared to the unexposed, right? It is much higher than it is more than 2 times the rate of a report of the same physical symptoms as in the unexposed. And then when we look at comorbidity, it's even higher, right? There was it was 13% compared to 4%. It was 3.5 times as many people had both psychiatric and physical symptoms at the 14th year. If you look at this slide, again, I'm just going to look at the low rate, and this is a chart that talks about the relative risk ratios. And I want to just highlight these 2 numbers, which are in pink, which is the physical morbidities. As I already mentioned to you, it was 2.49 was the relative risk ratio for having a physical disorder after being exposed to 9/11 as a child, 14 years later. And the relative risk rate for comorbidity is 4.6. And you might think, well, it's both physical and psychiatric, therefore it should be higher. But actually having them simultaneous, or having them in a combined fashion, and it's not quite simultaneous, but having both of them, actually the statistical prediction is this should be lower than each of them, but it was higher. And what that tells us is that it doesn't tell us this definitively, but the way the statisticians explain this is it seems to indicate that there may be a single element that is affecting both physical and psychiatric disorders. It may be driven in a singular fashion. Let me just say one more word about that, because as a result of this, we became more aware of the fact that the exposure to 9/11 was both a psychological exposure and a toxic exposure. So both were going on simultaneously. But we also know that merely the psychological exposure, and I'll talk about that in a moment, can also cause physical symptoms. So you're getting physical symptoms both from toxicology exposure, but you're also getting physical symptoms from the emotional exposure. And that accounts for those numbers. Let's dig a little bit deeper. And again, I had mentioned to you the 6 psychiatric disorders that we found immediately afterwards. Well, what about 14 years later? Well, interestingly, let's look at separation anxiety. And this is the adjusted odds ratio. Slightly different statistic than the relative odds ratio, but again, this has been adjusted for age and gender and the other covariates. We can see that you're twice as likely to have separation anxiety 14 years after you were exposed as a child to 9/11. You're also 2.5 times more likely to have panic disorder. And those were the 2. The other ones were not. We did not see elevated rates of PTSD. We didn't see elevated rates of anxiety. So it was a separation anxiety and the panic disorder. After 14 years, there may be some resilience and some adjustment to some of the other psychiatric disorders. But what about behaviorally? Well, look at this. There's 2 times more likelihood to be abusing marijuana if you had been exposed to 9/11. And then in terms of any anxiety disorder or any internalizing disorder, those two were elevated. What about overall living? How you're doing? You're exposed to 9/11 14 years ago. How are you doing? So I want you to notice that these odds ratios now are less than 1 because this is the odds ratio of a positive outcome. All right. And notice that the odds ratio of positive outcome here is less than 1. So they have about half the chance of living with a spouse or a partner. So if I compare them with the tight controls, if I was exposed to 9/11, 14 years later, I have about half the chance that I have moved out of family house and I'm living with a spouse. What about if just moving out of the house, living independently, even if you're not in a relationship? That also pretty close, a little bit better, tiny bit better, but also close to, you have half the probability to have what we in the child psychiatry refer to as failure to launch. This slide, I'm not going to go into detail, but it just covers the fact that the life disruptions that we had mentioned about the number of times that you moved was also a factor that predicted alcohol use and separation anxiety. And then when we broke it down by age, and we had the following. If we just look at age 5 to 9, again, looking at them now 14 years later, and I'm just giving you what the strongest findings, and that was that you were more likely to have used alcohol and more likely to have used marijuana in the past month, almost twice as likely if you were exposed between the ages of 5 to 9. And that speaks to some of the developmental stuff, right? There are certain windows of vulnerability we know during development. So what about ages 10 to 14? In that case, you were almost 4 times as likely to have generalized anxiety disorder. And you were also have about 1/3 the chance of living independently. So these were specific, the more broken down age specific outcomes, both in terms of psychopathology, in terms of substance relationships, and in terms of anxiety. Those were the outcomes. Now, one of the things that we introduced here, again, which comes out of the field of what's something called computational psychiatry, which is a misnomer. It really means the psychiatry of how decision-making works. We use something called the delay discounting task. And the delay discounting task is a formalization of the marshmallow experiment. Some of you may be familiar with the marshmallow experiment, testing whether a child can postpone gratification. You say, here's one marshmallow. I'm going to leave you alone for 10 minutes, and if you don't eat it, you get a bunch of marshmallows. It turns out that the capacity to postpone gratification has a lot of long-term predictive effects on actually SAT scores 20 years later, et cetera. So it's a very important a skill, a very important cognitive skill. And the ICT, the intertemporal choice task, does a similar thing, except it's not with marshmallows, it's with money. If you're willing to wait, you get more money later. So you can have $1 now, or you could have $2 in a week. And it turns out that the 9/11 exposed kids have a lower proportion of taking the sooner smaller, which is to say that they were better at postponing reward. This was a surprising account. We're still trying to understand it better. We think maybe that the kids who were exposed, they may have been sensitized to being more careful, is one way to think about this, right? Being a little bit more careful about things. And so when asked whether they want $1 now, $2 later, and this is much more complicated task than just, the single question. We have different time gaps and different amounts of money work into this. But it seems like they were a little bit more careful about this, and interestingly, more able to postpone gratification. The reason I'm speaking in semi-whispered tones here is because this does run against a number of findings that people who have been traumatized have the opposite, that they have a I can say this word, I promise, foreshortened sense of the future, right? The foreshortened sense of the future is part of what we know about PTSD. And this finding runs contrary to that. So it was quite interesting. We're going to continue to follow up in our analysis of that. So the baseline summary, 14 years after exposure as a child, you have a higher rate of physical disorders, you have a higher rate of psychiatric disorders, and you have an even higher rate of physical and psychiatric comorbidities. And again, taken together, this says to us that the exposure has both physical and psychiatric disorders, but we also believe, and we have evidence from later in other studies, we have evidence that the psychological exposure can have physical effects by itself. And we also believe that the toxicological exposure can have psychiatric symptoms. So both exposures work across both things, probably working through common systematic physiologic methodology. In other words, the great question was asked before about immunology. We know that changes in immunology can affect physical health, can affect psychiatric health, and so this is an active area of study. How do each of these exposures cross the brain-body distinction? There were limitations to the study. Obviously, many of you might have noticed the limitations are that the physical morbidity was simply based on parent and child self-evaluation. We had no physical exams. We had no, objectively measured things. And we also didn't know very much about the temporality of when did the physical conditions precede the psychiatric or follow them. And it turned out that almost nobody had been looking at, especially in children and adults. Of course, they were looking at the double exposure of trauma and toxins, but in children, almost nobody was. When I say almost nobody, a rare exception was your host, Tony Szema, and Tony, was a very early understood the notion of lung-brain connections, and very much understood that these were double exposures. And I'm not going to go through his findings because the slide here is that our follow-up study, we collaborated with Tony because we realized that, he had been onto something we completely missed, which was looking at the physical stuff in great detail, and worrying about the toxic exposures. So this was our S&W follow-up. It has a long formal name, 9/11 Trauma and Toxicity in Childhood, Longitudinal Health and Behavioral Outcomes. And again, this is Dr. Hoven is the lead investigator on this. And what were our aims there? So we wanted to characterize physical health status, focusing on pulmonary disease and allergic immunologic consequences. And the aim two was to examine gene-environment interactions and determine genetic vulnerability. And the aim three was to examine these comorbidities and how they impacted education, application, and functional outcome. And this study that I'm describing, I should have said this to start with because I'm sorry this is kind of a tease and I'm frustrating you. This is an ongoing study. We don't have the physical findings yet. We have collected a great deal of them, but we don't have them yet. So I only have very few preliminary findings on that. But I wanted to give you a sense of coming out of that first study, how we moved more towards the somatic area. As a psychiatric group, we were forced to move more into the somatic area. So just say a few more things about that study. There are the aims, and here are the most important selected measures. Again, the psychosocial assessments was all the same stuff that we had done before, but then we also looked with Tony Szema as our collaborator. We looked at St. George Respiratory Questionnaire, the vital signs, exercise capacity, a 6-minute walk, and then measures of airway obstruction, as Tony had talked about, spirometry, and even doing impulse oscillometry, and then doing exhaled nitric oxide to look for eosinophilic airway inflammation in this group. And again, it's it's in that follow-up group 20 to 25 years later. Finally, what we did was we collected blood samples for future analysis. We're going to be looking at cytokines. We've started to look at VIP and at DNA and RNA and trying to understand what is it that is not just physical or psychiatric, but what are the systematic impacts of this exposure? So here are the preliminary findings that I can give you are just from the questionnaires. And these are from the SF-36, which is a questionnaire about well-being. But here I am, these early ones were about 20 years afterwards, and I still see a huge difference here. So self-reported level of energy is significantly different. Self-reported emotional well-being remains significantly different between the highly exposed and the unexposed, as you can see on this questionnaire. And more specifically, and again, this is on a subgroup of the sample, we see that we had much higher rates of sleep apnea, of reporting of 24 physical health conditions. So that finding done at 14 years has been sustained over the next 5 to 7 years. That they still have a much higher reported physical disorders, and we see also that if we look at what's called any internalizing disorders, that is anxiety and or depression, that we have continued morbidity in terms of that psychiatric disorder. So putting this all together, what can we say? Traumatic exposures in childhood have long-lasting mental health consequences. These exposures also get under the skin and have systemic physical health consequences. And so the takeaway for most of the people who are in this particular thing, this is not a psychiatric talk, but this is a talk to physical health specialists. The take home for you is that you don't have to be a psychiatrist to ask about childhood trauma. Childhood trauma may impact lung functions with or without, and I haven't really shown you detailed evidence of this, but hopefully in future talks I can get into the future thing where we can differentiate and make the argument that the psychological trauma has physical impact, and that toxicology has physical impact, and together they're synergistic. But it's very important to ask and to be aware of childhood exposures. I think many of you know that just in terms of panic disorders, in terms of a panic disorder, patients presenting with shortness of breath. Tony's done again a lot of work on psychological aspects of asthma, which I think is the best known disorder in which there is a mind-body connection. So while 9/11 was a terribly tragic event, I really appreciate all the researchers who have tried to extract some knowledge from it, both for the well-being of those who were exposed so that we can follow them and give them better health. And we believe that they should be followed for a lifetime, and that they should be covered for a lifetime in terms of the health consequences, and for general knowledge that can help others regarding their psychiatric and physical health. So thank you for your attention. And with that, I'll turn it back to Tony.
Thank you, Dr. Amsel. Do we have any questions from the audience? We thank everybody for taking time on this day to participate. We really appreciate this. It will be posted onto YouTube and the American Thoracic Society website for the section on terrorism and inhalation disasters, and on our X site.
And I would just add this questions now is for Tony's talk as well, because we didn't take time for that. So please.
Yeah, Dr. Szema, this is Nick Nichols. I was one of the members of the team that did the environmental sampling in Uzbekistan at Karchikahanabad, and I've communicated with you before. I just wanted to know, with the data that you've collected, how much of that can you correlate directly in the adult population between the 9/11 and the people from New York and the soldier population, if there's a direct correlation in the cancer rates or the disease rates of people who have had these levels of dust and smoke inhalation over a course of time, now that we're removed 24 years from that point in time. And I see where you're trying to extrapolate that in with the other events, but specifically those two events and how they're related in time.
So that's a great question. Even though it's been 24 years, the latency for developing lung cancer is even longer. It's 30 or 40 years. And the lung cancer rates for World Trade Center exposed in children and adults are not yet higher than that of the general population. That being said, the slide that I showed is part of a cohort of about 8 lung cancer biopsies among persons who were below Canal Street who got lung cancer. So we're trying to continue to evaluate the other samples from the different patients and determine if they all have, burned JA1 commercial jet fuel in their lungs. The other issue is, like you point out, for the Department of Veterans Affairs, they sunsetted the open air burn pit registry. So there is no real longitudinal monitoring. So right now we're collaborating with Dr. Henry Mayo Molaski at the Oklahoma VA and Andrea Covey at the Kansas City, Missouri VA, which covers several states. But there are about 8,000 in each cohort to see if our rapid 8-question questionnaire can to detect or count lung cancer rates. So Andrea Covey has a lung cancer screening program. She's saving all of her biopsies, and we're trying to go back and find out among the people who got a biopsy in the VA in Kansas City, were they exposed to burn pits? How old were they? Were they exposed to cigarette smoking? So it's an extremely important question. Like you said, we don't have all the answers yet.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
This also relates to what I showed, Nick Favazza showed, if we gave World Trade Center dust with known carcinogens in it. Another medical student, now a doctor, Mark Pochand Huang, he's a medicine resident at Rutgers in Newark. He gave the same World Trade Center dust down to mice, and he found cancer tumor markers were upregulated by that special technique, imaging mass cytometry, before you can see anything under light microscopy. So we know that with super sensitive and specific techniques, you can already know that things are being turned on that are pro-carcinogenic before you see the cancer. We just haven't kept the mice alive long enough to wait for them to get cancer, and it's gonna be another decade or two before we see even higher cancer rates. Similarly, we're looking at vaping among children. Or, in our school district around here, the high school kids engage in something called hot boxing. They're like Cheech and Chong, and they roll up the windows of the Tesla, and they smoke and they vape until the windows fog up. That's 2.5 million middle school and high school kids. We don't expect to see an epidemic of lung fibrosis or lung cancer among these kids for like 30 or 40 years. But we think that's possible, considering that these kids will vape for multiple hours per day, and they do it all during high school and middle school.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Szema and Dr. Amsel. My name is Derek Corpus. I'm one of the pediatric pulmonologists over at Cedars-Sinai. I guess first, shameless plug, but thank you for these talks, but also we're excited to collaborate with you in the future, near future, at least for our workshop here at Children's LA. Sarah Heinonen is also on this call, and I believe Chris Landon was on here previously. I had a specific question about the toxic exposures, and if you knew, Dr. Szema, of any studies that had looked at the effects of the toxic exposures to cilia in the lungs. Um,
Oh, so like looking at electron microscopy after like World Trade Center dust in a mouse or things like that.
yeah, yeah, anything
That's a
along
great
those lines.
idea, and we haven't done that yet. But regarding the California wildfires, and I'm happy to visit you guys for the symposia. Our student who took that photo, Teddy Forsyth at LA County, has a garbage bag full of Malibu wildfire dust. So our future plans are to give that to the mice. And working with the Washington University's Environmental Engineering Department, we have a Department of Defense grant. The engineers have built a fake burn pit chamber that not only duplicates military burn pits, but could, any type of burning. So they have lung organoids or airway cells. So you could do, primary bronchial epithelial cells in a petri dish. You can do air-lung interface with lung organoid. So that is a great idea that we should look at.
Wonderful. Yeah, would love to connect and collaborate on that more at a later time. Thank you so much.
And we appreciate everybody for joining. You can always email us. I think Dr. Amsel put his email in there. It's lamsel01@gmail.com. Derek, the Children's Hospital program, can you tell everybody about the date?
Yes, it's on December 13, which is a Saturday. We are outlining we have a flyer that will be sent out pretty or ironed out fairly soon and can have that available. But yeah, it'll be at Children's Hospital in LA and starting around 8 a.m. But more deep for anyone that's interested. I don't know how you want us to connect. But yes, again, Sarah Heinen is also on this call. We can share our emails and whatnot if you'd like.
Sure, you can put it in the chat and we'll post it to the American Thoracic Society section on terrorism and relational disaster Exxon website as well. So thank you. Great. So Tara from the ATS, do we have any other housekeeping items for today?
I do not believe so, Tony. Like I said, we will be putting the webinar up on the ATS website and on the corresponding YouTube channel in approximately a week. And everyone who registered for the webinar will also get an email of the link as soon as it is posted. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody, for presenting and participating. And we're going to end 9 minutes early. Appreciate everything. Thank you for taking time out on this very solemn day. All right, bye.
Thank you, Dr. Szema. Appreciate it.